Okay, so it's 1 minute past 6. Gonna kick off with the meeting. I imagine there'll be a few people joining in over the next minute or two, but I do appreciate it's a Friday for everyone, and we're keen to get on with the weekend. So without further ado, I shall start and welcome you to the webinar. This is our second webinar. We have done meetings. We've done one previous webinar like this. It is on the FIPS. Some of you may have attended it. The purpose of that meeting was just to go into a bit of a background on what FIPS are and how they operate and how to initiate and implement them. And the purpose of this webinar is to provide an introduction to RFMOs, how they operate, why they're important to our work, and how we can actually influence them. Just got a message for someone just checking the access. So I'll just hold on just a sec while they log into the system. So please bear with me just for a second. Okay, so we're all sorted, I think. So, like I said, this is the second webinar. We've done the first one on FIPS. Now, as part of our work on shelf-stable tuna, we are collaborating closely with Fisheries, and we have actually just developed a fully aligned procurement advice and RFMO engagement strategy with them. So, as well as our participants from the Global Fresh Frozen Tuna Supply Chain Roundtable and some of SFP's partners, I'm really pleased to welcome Fisheries' three major retail partners, Albertsons, Target and Hy-Vee, as well as Kathleen from Fisheries herself. And going forward, we really hope that this SFP Fisheries collaboration continues to evolve as a pre-competitive forum. So, did everyone? I'm hoping everyone got the next slide. I've just clicked through to the next slide. We did a dry run this morning and it worked fine. But do give us a shout if you can't see a slide that says "Why are we here today?" The objective of this webinar is to provide you with information on what tuna RFMOs are, how they operate, why they are important in sustainable fisheries, and how and why the supply needs to influence them. Can I just ask if you're not muted to mute yourselves, if that's possible? I think I can actually do it, which is good. That's great. Thank you. You can unmute yourself. I've just done that. Thank you. Just someone's flicked that up so they could hear some background noise. So what we're going to cover today, the webinar has actually been structured to tell the story, so to speak, of RFMOs. And what we're going to do is run through a number of areas culminating in our ask of the supply chain, plus our engagement strategy by which you can be effective agents of change with regards to RFMO advocacy. So you can see from the agenda, it's very much run through the basics of RFMOs, how they can be influenced, why it's important, and what is the big ask that we have at the moment of RFMOs. So kicking off at the beginning, what are RFMOs? This is the raw basics. They are international organizations that have been formed by the countries that have fishing interests in the area. So they don't necessarily have to be in the area, they must have to have fishing interests in the area. Now, some of the RFMOs, regional fisheries management organizations, managed all the fish stocks in a particular area, and some of them focus on the highly migratory species, which include really notably tuna. As I mentioned before, they're open to countries in the region, which we refer to as coastal states, and those countries with interest in the fisheries concerned. And an example there would be the UK has an interest in the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, even though we're obviously not based in the Indian Ocean. That's via both the EU delegation and the British Indian ocean territory. Now, RFMOs do have powers to manage both the catch and fishing efforts, other technical measures for tuna and associated species in the area. So their job is to manage the fisheries. Here is a diagram that gives you an overview of the 5 tuna RFMOs. You can see there is some overlap in the coverage of them. One of them, the Commission for the Conservation of Southern Bluefin Tuna, is focused just on, as you can imagine, southern bluefin tuna, whilst the others do consider multiple species. Now, the ones that we are most interested in from a fresh frozen tuna SR perspective is the Indian Ocean and the West Central Pacific. Now, that's not to say there's no fresh frozen tuna coming in via other areas, but this is the area that we're focusing on the SR. Now, our shelf-stable tuna actually extends to the IATTC and the ICAT as well. Some of the work, the Ecuadorian FIPS and tuna, for example, and also there's a number of important fisheries in the Atlantic region as well. So RFMOs can appear to be an unwieldy bureaucracy if you're not familiar with them, and it certainly is not always easy to appreciate how they're structured, because they do operate in slightly different ways in many instances. There's not one set uniform way of operating. What I've shown here is a structure of the IOTC, the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission. It is similar in other ones, but the idea here is to give you an overview of how they kind of operate. And what I'm going to do is just walk through some of these key points. It's really important to be aware of the terminology of RFMOs in order to engage them effectively. So the first thing we're going to begin with is the commission itself. Now, as you can see here, the commission, which I've highlighted, this is the main decision-making body, and it is composed of different, what we call delegations. The delegates who make the decisions are the members or the contracting parties. The influencers are the cooperating non-contracting parties, or CNCPs, and the observers. And you can see I put them in a box there because they're not formally part of the commission structure, but they do attend the commission meetings. So you can see when we refer to delegates, we're talking about the actual members and the CNCPs, because they do have an influence. So the members, their membership is open to coastal states. So these are the countries in the actual area, or regional economic integration organizations, which are a member of the UN or one of its specialized agencies, such as the FAO, that are fishing for tuna in the convention area. The CNCP, this is for states with an interest in the convention area. They don't have to pay the membership fee that the other member states are obliged to, and they don't enjoy voting rights, but they are subject to the same regulations. So that if you were a member there and you were a part of the RFMO, you would be subject to the regulations that come out of the Commission. Now, observers, this is where many of us will be interacting with RFMOs. You have to be pre-approved. You can't just turn up to a meeting. You don't have voting rights, and they do include bodies such as the FAO, the NGOs like SFP and Fisheries, members of the catching sector, and of course invited experts. This is certainly how we interact with RFMOs. The next level down is what we call the subsidiary bodies. There's generally 3 subsidiary bodies in RFMOs. They provide technical advice, guidance, recommendations, and they do have specific functions. The chairs are actually appointed by the Commission themselves. And if you just, we can go through them very quickly. The Compliance Committee, this meets with the Commission to monitor and promote compliance with the decisions. In some RFMOs, observers are welcome to attend these meetings, but not so in others. The Scientific Committee, this is the one that we are, I would say, of all the groups we're primarily interested in. I think that's probably the same for many of the NGOs. This meets annually before the Commission meeting, and what it does is it provides the advice to the Commission on various aspects of the status of the stocks, opinions on management options, and their implications for both the stocks and the fisheries. So what it does is it provides the information to the Commission to effectively make evidence-based decisions. And this is not an unusual arrangement. This is something that happens in the European Commission, for example, under the CFP as well. I haven't bothered talking about the admin and finance committees because that's not really something any of us would want to get involved in. Now, underneath the scientific committee themselves, there will be a number of working parties, and these feed into the scientific committee with specific information. They analyse the technical problems related to the management goals of the commission. So you can see there for the IOTC, there's a number of different ones, such as there's a working party on billfish, neritic tuna, tropical tuna, etc. Now these would vary depending on the RFMO, but their purpose is the same. It's to provide that detailed analyses that can feed into the scientific committee, who will then make suggestions of management to the commission. So each RFMO operates in a slightly different way. I mentioned that before. For example, some require consensus on decisions, while others have the opportunity to use voting. For the IOTC, what I've done here is I've just covered a general overview of how they operate. So at each session of the commission, so this is the meeting, the actual commission meeting where the delegates attend, the members may adopt something called conservation and management measures, or CMM. And this is important to be aware of because you'll probably often hear about CMMs. And this is actually concerning the management of the fisheries. Now, these decisions themselves are passed in either resolutions or recommendations. Now, the resolutions are binding unless, and this is where it gets a bit complicated, unless there is a specific objection by a member, and then they will require a vote with a 2/3 majority. Recommendations are not binding, and these are voluntary, and this just requires a simple majority to do that. So there is a difference between resolutions and recommendations. WCPFC operates in a slightly different way. They also have CMMs, and these are adopted at the annual commission meeting, which always takes place in either the first week in December or the last week in November, or the overlap. Now, these describe binding decisions related to management, and again, they will apply to both the members and the cooperating parties. Now, they have a slightly different term here. The resolutions describe non-binding statements and recommendations addressed to the members. So it's just worth being aware of. And the whole point of these slides is just to demonstrate that they're not identical in their operation. So, how are they performing at the minute? I mean, not ideally, I would say. Now, reviews are carried out on RFMO performance, both formally. For example, the FAO have done reviews on their performance. And if you do a search of the academic literature, you will find several analyses, various different metrics of RFMO's performances. There's one by an ex-colleague of ours called Eric Gilman, looking at the ecosystem-based approach in RFMOs. I would say their performance is rarely described as great, if I was being fair. The actions, we've got a couple of bullets here, the actions are often neither benign nor always in the interest of delivering sustainable fisheries management. There is a lot of self-interest by certain parties, certainly not all of them, that can end up blocking measures that would ultimately have a long-term positive outcome. There's a lot of short-term thinking going on. Even when there are good measures, it's often the case that they're not fully complied with. And of course, by not being fully complied with, it undermines their effectiveness, and it just makes the whole job harder, because if you've got a regulation in place and it's not working, it's even more difficult than not having one and actually putting one in place. This is all compounded by the fact that there is really inadequate levels of funding to do the assessments, the monitoring, the control and surveillance. What I've done here is just to demonstrate the point here. This is the West Central Pacific Fisheries Commission. A target was set in 2007 for 5% observer coverage in longline vessels. So that was 10 years ago. The target was actually set, and they gave 5 years for it to become a requirement. And you can see that it's only 9 have actually met the requirement, whereas 7 haven't even got anywhere. Now, this may be due to reporting. They may actually have some observers, but they're just not reporting them. But either way, it's a breakdown in the system. So you can see the performance here is not great. However, we like to be positive, and this can sound very discouraging, but in our view, concerted aligned pressure can result in improved performance of the RFMOs. Now, this concerted aligned pressure is trying to be achieved through NGO collaborations and supply chain collaborations, to be fair. Early efforts of this have included sign-on letters, which have been coordinated by one or two NGOs. ISSF, for example, do coordinated sign-on letters for NGOs to circulate to their supply chain partners. One of the challenges with this is that they often include a lot of people's priorities and asks, and you can end up with a very lengthy, complex letter that tries to appease everyone. And that in itself can get lost in the noise. SFP tends not to join such asks unless they align very closely with our goals. However, there have been efforts underway to identify priority issues that the NGO community can align and focus on. And there is a vehicle called the Global NGO Tuna Forum for delivering this. And both SFP and Fishwise are members of that. And what they're focusing on at the moment, they had a meeting in May, there's a follow-on meeting in October, is the implementation of harvest strategies in RFMOs. And we will come back to that later. But I wanted to just note that this is something that we're aware of in the NGO community, and there is a real appetite for trying to get alignment on what we're actually asking for. So the process of influencing RFMOs can be summarized in 4 steps, and there is many ways you could do this or show this sort of summary, and this is just one way of demonstrating it. And I've used SFP as an example here, but the first step is an ask of the RFMOs is identified. Now this should be developed from an evidence base. For example, it could be on a population impact or an impact on a specific endangered, threatened or protected species, or a perceived need. So once you have actually identified the ask, the second step involves the NGO or the NGOs explaining clearly what the ask is and why, and setting out how it can be achieved. And this is how we're going to do this through something called an engagement strategy. And it was not only does it explain what we're asking for, but how it can actually take place. The third step is working with our partners in the supply chain to amplify the impact of the request. It is absolutely no use SFP asking an RFMO to do something. There's plenty of lobbyists out there asking for things. What we need is amplified impact from the supply chain saying, this is important, we need this to happen. Our businesses depend on this, livelihoods of people depend on this being a sustainable fishery, and this is how you can get there quicker. And the fourth step is actually getting that through to the delegation. So we've shared it through the supply chain. You've asked your suppliers, they've asked their customers, they've asked their fishers. This is all important. We should all get behind this ask. This is why it's important. And then it's actually advocating it through the delegations. So this is the delegation heads, the teams, the scientific leads, the fisheries ministers, for example, of the flag state where your business is based, as well as the flag states of any countries that you're doing business with. Now, how can they be influenced? We really believe that the key to success is focusing on what we're trying to achieve. Firstly, through NGO alignment on the asks. What we don't want is there's a number of different organizations out there who have different partners in the supply chain. We all realize now that we have to be focused, we have to be aligned on this. It really isn't helping anyone if we're all asking for slightly different things, even though they might all be positive and beneficial. If we can get alignment on this, it's going to really help our cause. Let's not try to lobby for everything all at once, and so the actual key things that matter get lost in the noise. Secondly, we need to be very clear on the rationale of the ask. We need to not only say this is what we want, we must be very clear about why and what it will do. The next step is to build up support throughout the supply chain on the need for the ask and the importance in achieving it. And finally, we really need to be laser focused in our advocacy to make sure the ask is heard by the right people. Writing letters is important, but it's not the only thing we should be doing. There are other things we should be doing, and we need to be doing everything. And we need to do this again and again and again. And I've put a health warning here. it might seem that, I'm simplifying this, but we are very aware that our interests are only just one of many. Delegations going to receive input from many different sources. Maybe at the minute they're receiving interest from only a few of the stakeholders. But there are other issues at play here, such as I put down foreign policy goals, for example. So we have to be realistic. We have to set realistic expectations, but there's nothing to stop us trying. And they can be influenced. And here is an example from the IOTC, where harvest control rules were introduced for skipjack last year. And this took months of meetings and collaboration amongst many different organisations, including fishers, industry groups, and retailers. Includes our colleagues at the International Pole and Line Federation, who were supported by MSC and WWF, the ISSF, UK supermarkets, including Sainsbury's, Marks and Spencer's, to helping build support for a proposal by the Maldivian government. As this got up ahead of steam, further number of retailers and brands got involved and added their voice to the calls for the harvest control rules, and ultimately it was put in place. So it can be achieved. At this point, I'm going to pass over to my colleague Jeff, who does a lot of our work with RFMOs, and he'll hand back over to me in a couple of slides' time. Is that okay with you, Jeff? You're okay?
Yeah, just unmuting. Okay, so Tom's new broad brush outline, and one of the issues that we perceive in this is that the catching sector are already in there on delegations. They're talking to delegates, they're getting their message across, which is usually about catching opportunity, not necessarily fisheries sustainability. So SFP has applied for and been granted observer status at both the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission and more recently the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission. And now we go to Western Central Pacific meetings for about 3 years. So we have a good understanding of how these organisations operate. As part of that, Tom is a member of the UK stakeholder Tuna RFMO group. This is a government initiative, so it's run by the Department for Environment, DEFRA. I'm part of the New Zealand stakeholder Tuna RFMO group because that's where I happen to live, and actually have been on the New Zealand delegation as an observer, but on the delegations for a full delegation member for some of the WCPFC meetings. New Zealand tend to take some industry and some observers into their delegations by way of sort of trying to meet their commitments to be open and transparent. So typically SFP would send between 1 and 3 staff. Usually it's 1 or 2 these days, to attend both commission meetings and particularly the scientific committee meetings, where a lot of the drive to get things like harvest control rules and the other elements of the harvest strategies developed and sort of pre-agreed before it goes to commission. So our objectives in attending these meetings has been to observe what goes on, who does what, who's proactively driving sustainability, which groups are trying to block it. We can begin to sort of plan how best to engage with the different groups and different delegations. So where appropriate, we, as observers or from within the delegations, also support or oppose measures or certain elements of measures. Now we can either do this in our own right as observers, making comments about the discussions that are ongoing, or we can do that through our own delegation if we are a member of the delegation, or as in the third bullet here, we can talk to other delegations at the meeting and get them to propose specific elements And the reason for doing that is a proposition coming from a member is always stronger than one coming from an observer. And if the proposals are sensible, then they will pick. They do pick them up. They don't pick all of them up, but they do pick some of them up, and it does work. So SFP and some other NGOs also participate in some of the subgroups. So as I say, especially the scientific committees and occasional compliance meetings. Increasingly, we find we're benefiting from attending some of the technical working groups, particularly on FADs, so that's FAD design, particularly FAD management, the development and implementation of harvest strategies and the components of that, including things like harvest control rules and how they're developed. Next. So, we have developed some priorities. Now, we've developed priorities because there are very many challenges facing the tuna fisheries in terms of their sustainability. So here's a list. It's a longish list, but it's not comprehensive by any means. So you've got non-alignment of member objectives. So different members want different things. Some members want to maximise catch of one species. Other members want to maximise catch of another species, and they're mutually exclusive. So they can't both happen. There are gear conflicts where you get the same gears catching different components of the same population, or actual physical conflict where people want to fish with different gears in the same locations. There are issues of overfishing. There's issues of overfished stocks. There's certain areas where management is clearly lacking. There's poor enforcement. There's inadequate observer coverage, which Tom showed you a really clear evidence of that from the Western Pacific. There are some fisheries which are data deficient. There's just not enough information. This is particularly true for some of the bycatch species. Attempts to do shark stock assessments largely fail because the data that's being collected is not of adequate quality. There are various issues with bycatches. So we've worked quite hard at trying to develop a priority. Next, Tom. And the one that we've chosen as the highest priority is to try and address this lack of management. And we've chosen this principally because so much of the others will be improved with better management. So if you improve the management, the issues about overfishing go away largely, and enforcement generally improves, and you generally get better observer coverage, and you get better data. So this is the key one for us, and that's why we've prioritised it. Next. So within the RFMOs, the fisheries management decisions continue to be based predominantly on short-term objectives. And these are putting the long-term sustainability of many tuna fisheries at risk. And by short-term objectives, we're talking, maybe a year, maybe 2 years, certainly not 5 or 10. Now, SFP believes that harvest strategies or other forms of pre-agreed frameworks for making fisheries management decisions. So this includes things like setting limits to catch or setting limits to effort or other technical measures, closed areas, closed periods of time, closed seasons. All of these would help move beyond the current gridlock that we often see in the tuna RFMOs. So if something's been pre-agreed that you're going to take this particular action when a stock falls below or rises above some threshold, it saves having to have the fight again at that time because the decision's already been made. So all the RFMOs have programs in place to develop harvest strategies. And some of them are progressing quite well and others are progressing less well. This is taking an incredibly long time. So What tends to happen is harvest strategies tend to be developed for one species rather than across all of them, or components are done across the board, but only one component and the other elements are not developed concurrently. So it's, in order to get this in place, if left to their own, the RFMOs would probably take, I don't know, another decade or maybe two in some cases. So we want to speed that up. We want to get them to make better decisions and faster decisions. So this is a very colourful slide, but in all of the wrong ways. Looking at the core principles of harvest strategy. So these are the elements on the left. So whether you have objectives, clear objectives, whether you've got target reference points for the stocks, that's the stock status at which you're trying to manage. So you want the stock to increase up to that or decrease down to that. So you want it fluctuating around the target reference point. Whether there are limit reference points. These are the bounds of stock status below which you don't want the stock to go because it increases risk of stock collapse. There are harvest control rules. These are these pre-agreed rules that ensure that action is taken at an appropriate time as things approach or cross thresholds. There are performance indicators about just monitoring how you're doing and what you know how you're doing in relation to the various objectives and reference points. And there are various statistical things like management strategy evaluations, which can be really useful in testing the robustness of the management that you have in place. And it tested against things which are difficult to conceive, things like global warming, changes in regime structure in bits of the ocean, as you certainly see in the Eastern Pacific with El Nino and so forth. There needs to be defined acceptable levels of risk. How much risk are you prepared to take in terms of a stock breaching the limit reference point? Would be a classic example. And there are various strategies which you need to monitor all of this. And this all combines together to form the basis of a harvest strategy. So you've got two tuna commissions here. Indian Ocean is the middle column, Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission is the right-hand column. And basically, red means there's woefully inadequate provision for the different elements. Yellow means there's something going on. Green means there's some in place. It doesn't mean it's comprehensive for that element within that commission. It just means there's been some activity. So, for example, in the WCPFC, there's limit reference points for most of the target tunas, but not all of them. And they certainly don't have limit reference points for the key bycatch species, so the big sharks and other critters that are impacted. You can also see there's differences in species. So in the Indian Ocean, there is a harvest control rule for the yellowfin stock. There isn't for the big eye stock. And again, this is partly just how they structured the work program, but also there's more focus on some species than others because they're perceived as being either more at risk or usually less at risk and more valuable. Next slide, please. So, priorities that we've collectively developed, and these aren't just our ideas. We've listened to both the supply chain and also other NGOs and had discussions with other scientific establishments. We kind of come up with two fairly clear recommendations to drive this priority of getting better management. One is to establish and implement at least interim limit reference points. It doesn't matter if they're final reference points, we'd be happy with interim reference points, and target reference points for all key stocks, and that's all of the tuna species, it's all of the billfish, and it's the key bycatch species, so For example, the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission has key shark species which are named, and it seems sensible to work to develop reference points for all of these species because they're all highly impacted by fishing. The second component is to develop and implement a system of these pre-agreed management actions, so-called harvest control rules, or sometimes described as management procedures, that adjust catch or effort in response to change in the stock abundance to keep the stock fluctuating around the target reference point and above the limit reference point, taking into account the components of risk. So we've boiled all of these long list of things where we recognised improvement was necessary to just these two components to make it easy for people to understand and to try and increase the probability that we will actually have success in getting some of these implemented.
Great, thank you very much. Can I just check that you can hear me? If someone could just say yes or type in yes. Oh, great, super. I just wanted to check so I don't go off on one. Okay, so you may be wondering, well, I'm looking at FIPS. Why is this important to me? And it's a very good question. How does this link in with our procurement advice, for example? Quite simply, as I say there, they operate synergistically by working at the fishery level and at what we call sort of the political level via the RFMO. We can achieve the goal of sustainable tuna fisheries. Now, easy to say, but what do we mean by this? In this diagram, what I've tried to do is explain that the existence of a tuna FIP can support RFMO advocacy around harvest control rules, for example, or target reference points, by actually demonstrating the need from the supply chain themselves. But saying, look, we have this fishery. The thing that's holding it back is a lack of management. We're doing everything we can at the vessel level, but we cannot get to where we want to be because of the hold up here. So it's a demonstrable ask that is going to be hugely effective compared to just an empty letter, really, that just says, we want this. Conversely, progress towards the harvest strategy, as covered by Jeff, will deliver improvements in the stock status of tuna fisheries, because that is the purpose of the management, and will ultimately enable fisheries that maybe thought they had no chance of entering FIPS or even get beyond the initial stages of FIPS succeed. So you can see there is this circular approach where you have the commercial leverage pushing for the implementation of a harvest strategy, which will result in improved stock status, which will lead to the greater success rate of FIPS, both of which goes to sustainable tuna fisheries, which is everyone's goal. So we don't expect us to just hang up this call and for you to go and engage with RFMOs on your own. Some of you, I'm sure, will be able to do that, no problem at all, and maybe have done that in the past. But we have been working on a three-tiered approach of engagement with increasing levels of commitment or engagement. Tier 1, or the basic level engagement, really is the minimum we're seeking from our roundtable participants, and we'd also like to see our retail partners do the same. What you're doing here is we will provide template text and ask you to contact the delegations where you're based and where you source from or wish to source from, seeking the timely implementation of harvest strategies through the ask that Jeff just went through. So this is very much the basic level entry. And it may only have very limited results. So, we really don't want to be at Tier 1. Tier 2, or mid-level engagement, builds on Tier 1 and it involves further communication with delegates, including stakeholder groups like the ones, again, Jeff covered, the UK stakeholder group, for example. There's other stakeholder groups out there to explain your asks further. For example, noting how they're required to meet your commitments or your customers' commitments, And it really getting the message across that this is important. As a taxpayer or as a stakeholder, this is important and you want action taken. We also, under Tier 2, we would want you to cascade the asks to your suppliers, whether they be other people in the supply chain or the fishers themselves, and try to explain to them this is important and we want your engagement in this. This is part of what we expect from doing business with you. Tier 3, or active engagement, is where you actively engage with national governments beyond the delegates, perhaps fisheries ministers at home or overseas, trade bodies, fishing organisations, to set out your asks. You are hugely important people in terms of the tuna fishing industry, and you have enormous leverage. And it's important that the people in the decision-making positions are aware of this. This could also include attendance at RFMO meetings or other fora. And in each of these tiers, we will assist you. We do not expect you to do this yourselves. We will provide you details of people. We can try to set up meetings. We can facilitate meetings individually or collaboratively. We are keen to engage on this with you proactively. So going forward, we will be sharing the information that you'll need in each tier of engagement, starting off with Tier 1 and moving onwards. We are going to support you on this journey. You just have to ask us. It's really key for us that this is viewed as important as getting FIPS initiated and implemented. It's really important that we record what you're doing and what responses you receive or any outcomes that occur. This will help us and our colleagues in the NGO community tweak the strategy. Is there anything that works well? Is there anything that doesn't work? It's a learning exercise as well. A real key factor here is collaboration. The more that we can work together and amplify the ask, the more likely it is that we're going to be able to achieve change. It's great. It's absolutely super if someone is able to meet a fisheries minister on their own in a coastal state. If you're able to take a delegation of yourselves or even come on behalf of a group of people, it just adds a huge amount of weight. And again, we are here to help. We have people on the ground in many of these countries, who, as do our colleagues, we will be able to assist in getting these meetings set up. So now we have an opportunity for questions or concerns or comments, anything like that, before we sort of move on to the final slide, which really is a wrap up. So I hope you found that interesting and informative. I'd be very interested to hear your views on our approach. You can question either by unmuting yourself and asking a question, or typing in the chat function, which I'm sure some of you have seen. If not, you go to the toolbar and more, and the first drop down is chat. There's myself and Jeff and Alexia from the Tuna team online, and I believe Catherine from our buyer engagement division team is also with us. But I'm sure between us we'll be able to answer any questions. If we can't, we'll get back to you by email. This is potentially good or bad. Yeah, thank you, Jose. I did receive your email. That's very helpful. Looks like we're very much on the same page. Sorry, that was just I got a message from. I think he's coming to everyone, so you can see that. Please don't feel that I put you on the spot here. If you have any questions, you'd rather email me or one of the team. Obviously, feel free to do that. It's not a problem at all. We can get back to you. So I'll just going once, going twice. Okay, I will move on to the final slide, which is just a wrap up. We really do believe that supply chain engagement in the RFMO process is going to work. We do believe we can make a real difference if by focusing on a priority area and actually building this critical mass of supply chain ask. And by doing that, we really believe that we're going to get some movement. We're not approaching RFMOs cold. They are, sustainability is not a fad or a buzzword. It's in people's minds. I think we just need to push harder than we have been. The asks that Jeff covered are aligned with the Global NGO Tuna Forum ask, and going forward, the aim is to work collaboratively with the other NGOs and their supply chain partners, calling for the same thing. So it's not just SFP and Fishwise's partners together, for example. It's the other NGOs in this community working together to actually get pretty much everyone that we can asking for the same thing. And then that's where we're going to see change. So hopefully this is a refreshing approach. We certainly believe it's going to be more effective than what has gone on with the best intention previously. And on that point, I will leave it there, other than to say thank you very much for joining. The webinar has been recorded. We will circulate the link to the recording. I will also circulate the link, or I'll also circulate the slides as well. And if you would like any more information or anything, please let me or the team know. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Andriana, do you want a conversation with me on that question, or do you want me to answer it now? Oh, so okay. I've unmuted you, Andriana.